Did you know that the overwhelming majority of Black Americans up until the early 1930s were actually Republicans? Yes, it's true. So, this is another one of my Politics for Young People videos. And even if you don't care much about politics, and I respect that if that's the case, you still need to understand how it works. All politicians on both sides of the aisle will try and manipulate you, so you need to be informed. And I'm the one person in your life who will never lie to you. And I have to say, in all of these Politics for Young People videos, I've been on both sides of the aisle, either as a conservative Democrat or moderate Republican. So, as I said, most Black Americans used to be Republicans. That was mainly due to Abraham Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln was a Republican who freed Black slaves, and it's why to this day, even though unfortunately it's used by the Republican Party as merely a talking point with no substance, the Republican Party loves to always say, "We are the party of Lincoln." Things began to change in the early 1930s, however, when Franklin Roosevelt won his first term in office, beating incumbent Republican Herbert Hoover. This was 1932, only a few years after the Great Depression, and Hoover essentially did nothing to help Blacks recover from the economic turmoil this country suffered. It is important to point out, however, that even though Hoover didn't really do much for Blacks, about 75% of Black voters still voted for Hoover in 1932, even though he lost. Black voters actually hated FDR at the time. Yes, Black people hated Ferdinand Delano Roosevelt at first, since he was a Democrat and Democrats in the South suppressed Black voters and their rights. Do you remember my video, or if you haven't seen it yet, about white Southerners and how they were first Democrats and then converted to Republicans? I'll put the link in the description, and it should show up right about now for you. You should definitely check that out as sort of a sister video to this one. But things changed with FDR in his second term in office, known to many as the New Deal. The New Deal tried to reverse the decades-long policies of ignoring Blacks, and in some ways, you can say the Democrats and Roosevelt learned a valuable lesson in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Even though Blacks began to back Democrats, this wasn't, however, merely enough to take an entire group of people and shift them to the other side of the aisle. So what further happened? Well, about another 15 years went by, and we were now in the early 1960s. You had Kennedy and then Lyndon Johnson paving the way for civil rights. In 1964, when Lyndon Johnson ran for president, so remember he sat in during Kennedy's last year or so in office when Kennedy was killed, a conservative named Barry Goldwater was his Republican challenger. Goldwater was more to the right than most Republicans at the time, and he was actually nicknamed Mr. Conservative. At the 1964 Republican convention, when Goldwater accepted the nomination for his party, he said in his speech, quote, "Small government, a government that doesn't give out handouts to Black people, a government that doesn't have laws that interfere with states' rights." And this really was the catalyst. It was a clear path that helped Nixon with his Southern strategy that I mentioned in the other video. And at that point, the seismic shift of Blacks to the Democrat Party was complete, in the same way that there was a seismic shift of white Democrats to Republicans around the same time. Today, around 90% of Black voters align with the Democrat Party. Now, there is some evidence of a slight resurgence of Blacks voting Republican, but it's still very slight. So now you know what happened with the shift of voting bases between Republicans and Democrats and why these dynamics happened in the first place. So send me your comments and questions, and each week you'll get a chance to win a copy of one of my books, your choice, either my book on presentation skills or business writing skills.